In the spring of 2003, every wheat farmer in the Interlake region of Manitoba planted the same way, not because anyone had voted on it, not because it had been written down somewhere, because it was the only way that existed. You drove the same county roads, you stopped at the same co-op, you bought the same inputs from the same rep, and you did what your father had done, which was what his father had done before him, going back to when the land was still being broken from the original prairie. The Interlake was flat and wide, and the sky above it was enormous, and the soil underneath it was capable of growing good, hard red spring wheat if you treated it right, and every man in the region had been treating it the same way for 60 years. That was not a tradition. It was gravity. The Kowalczyk farm sat on 520 acres north of the town of Arborg, about an hour and a half north of Winnipeg on Highway 8. The land had been in the family since 1951, when Stefan Kowalczyk had come over from Poland with $40 and a suitcase, and had managed, through a particular combination of stubbornness and luck, to get a handshake agreement on a quarter section from a neighbor who was selling to move west. Stefan had added to it through the 50s and 60s. His son, Edmund, had added to it again through the 70s, and by the time Edmund's son, Walter Kowalczyk, was running the operation in the early 2000s, it was a real farm. The kind of farm that showed up in the local paper when yields were good and in the bank manager's office when they were not. Walter was 52 years old in the spring of 2003. He was a heavy man, quiet in the way that men become quiet when they have spent 30 years making decisions that nobody helped them make. He wore the same canvas jacket from March through November, and he kept his records in a blue ring binder that he had been refilling since 1989. He knew his soil. He knew his equipment. He knew the price of durum at the Thunder Bay terminal and the long-range forecast patterns that ran up from the American plains and what they meant for his July. He was not an arrogant man. He was a certain man. And there is a difference. Though from the outside, it can be hard to see it. Let me tell you about Walter's daughter, because she is the reason this story exists. Petra Kowalczyk was 27 years old in the spring of 2003. She had spent 4 years at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, and then 3 more years working for a small soil health consultancy out of Guelph, Ontario, that did on-farm assessments for grain operations across the prairies. She had driven more gravel roads than she could count. She had knelt in more fields and pushed soil probes into more ground than most agronomists twice her age. She had seen what 30 years of continuous wheat with fall tillage did to a field, and she had also seen what happened when a farmer stopped doing it. She had written a report about it once, 62 pages, commissioned by an Ontario land trust that had gotten passed around in certain academic circles and ignored everywhere else. She came home to Arborg in March of 2003 because her mother had had a hip surgery, and Walter needed help with the books through seeding season. That was the stated reason. The real reason was that she had been watching her father's fields from a distance for several years, and she had a growing conviction that the ground was telling him something he was not hearing. She brought it up on a Thursday night in April after supper when Walter was going through his input orders at the kitchen table. She did not ease into it. She had learned over 27 years that her father responded better to direct statements than to careful approaches, because careful approaches made him feel as though something was being managed around him. She put a folder on the table next to his coffee cup. She said, "I want to talk to you about the North Quarter." He looked at the folder. He looked at her. He said, "What about it?" She opened the folder. There were soil test results, printed on extension office paper, dated from the previous autumn. There was a photocopy of a journal article from the Canadian Journal of Soil Science. There was a hand-drawn map of the field with measurements written in red pen. She had done this herself on her own time, without telling him. She explained the way she had explained it to farm clients in 3 provinces. Soil organic matter had dropped from an estimated 5.2% based on a 1978 benchmark test Walter himself had done to 3.1% in 2002. 24 years of continuous tillage and fallow cycles had consumed more than 2% of organic matter. At the current rate of decline, the North Quarter would be farming on structural deficit by 2015. It would still grow wheat. It would just cost considerably more to make it do so. The solution she was proposing was not complicated. Stop tilling the North Quarter. Seed it down to a diverse perennial cover mix, a blend of native grasses, legumes, and deep-rooted forbs designed for the Manitoba Interlake climate, and leave it for 3 years. Let the soil biology rebuild. Let the fungal networks reestablish. Let the earthworm populations recover. 3 years of cover, then return it to production with a no-till seeder, and the field would come back at a higher baseline than it had started. The cost of the seed mix was around $28 per acre. The foregone income on 130 acres over 3 years was real. She had calculated it, including the Conservation Cover Program payment from Agriculture Canada that would offset roughly 60% of the revenue loss. Walter looked at the folder for a long time. He picked up the soil test and read it. He picked up the journal article and looked at the abstract. He set it back down. He said, "That's the North Quarter." She said, "I know." He said, "Your grandfather broke that quarter in 1958. She said, "I know that, too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me think about it." And he picked up his input orders again, which was how Walter Kowalczyk ended conversations he was not ready to finish. "Let me tell you about the Arborg Farm Supply on a Saturday morning in April, because it is the kind of place you need to understand before you can understand what happened there." The Arborg Farm Supply occupied a building on the main street that had been expanded 3 times since the 1970s, and the original part of it still smelled like the combination of fertilizer dust and machine oil that accumulates in prairie buildings over decades and never quite leaves. On Saturday mornings through seeding season, it was where the working farmers of the Interlake gathered. They came for parts, for supplies, for information, and for the particular social function that feed stores have served in agricultural communities since before any of them were born, the function of establishing and enforcing what was normal. The man who had, for the past 15 years, served as the unofficial authority on what was normal in that room was a fellow named Gordon Fleury. Gordon was the regional representative for one of the larger ag input companies operating in Manitoba, the kind of company that sold packaged fertility programs, seed treatments, and fungicide applications, and Gordon had been selling these things in the Interlake since 1988. He was 58, trim, well-organized, with the particular confidence of a man who has spent 30 years being right about what farmers should buy and has the commission statements to confirm it. He was not dishonest. He believed in what he sold, and he had sold it to Walter Kowalczyk for 22 years. Petra had stopped at the farm supply to pick up a part for the air seeder. She had not planned to say anything about what she and her father had discussed. But Gordon Fleury was behind the parts counter when she came in, and 2 other farmers she had known since childhood were standing near the seed display, and Gordon looked out the window and saw her truck and said, loud enough for the room to hear, that she had driven all the way from Ontario and still couldn't talk some sense into her father about getting a new variable rate applicator. It was a joke, a friendly one, the kind that happens in small towns between people who have known each other for years. But Petra had spent the morning going over the soil test numbers, and she was not in the mood to redirect. So she said, Actually, I'm trying to talk him into resting the north quarter." The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has been said that changes the temperature. Gordon looked at her. He said, "Resting it." She said, "3 years of perennial cover. Let the biology come back." Gordon set down the parts catalog he had been holding. He had the expression of a man who has heard something he finds almost too simple to engage with seriously. He said, "Petra, your father has 520 acres. He can't afford to pull 130 out of production for 3 years." She said, "I've run the numbers. With the AAFC program payment, the net revenue loss over 3 years is around," Gordon said, "the programs change. The markets change. You can't bank on a federal subsidy to cover a quarter section sitting idle." He looked at the other 2 farmers and said, "She's been in Guelph too long. They do things differently in Ontario." One of the men smiled. The other looked at his boots. Petra said it wouldn't be idle. A perennial cover mix seeded at $28 an acre is doing more biological work than a tilled fallow. Gordon shook his head, not angrily, but with the particular patience of a man explaining something he has explained before. He said, "Organic matter, Petra. Everyone's talking about organic matter right now. It's the fashion. But fashion doesn't pay the land taxes." He said it the way you say something when you're confident the room agrees with you. Petra picked up her parts bag. She did not argue further. She said, "I'll tell Dad you said hello," and she walked out. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone dismissed an idea not because they had examined it, but because examining it would have required them to question something they had spent 30 years not questioning? That was the room Petra Kowalczyk walked out of that April morning, and she drove home on the gravel road to the farm, and she did not say anything to Walter about what Gordon had said, because it was not useful information. It was just noise. Walter thought about it for 5 days. On the 6th day, he came in from the shop and found Petra at the kitchen table, with her laptop and her soil maps and her coverage calculations, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, "All right, the north quarter, do it your way. But I want the perimeter kept clean and I want the fence line maintained," she said. "Of course," he said, "and if it looks like a mess by year 2, we talk again." She said that was fair. Let me tell you about the seeding, because the details matter, and because this kind of story usually skips them in favor of the outcome. And the outcome only makes sense if you understand what went into the ground. Petra sourced the seed mix through a native plant supplier out of Winnipeg, a combination of Caesar milkvetch, native fescues, sainfoin, Alsike clover, and 2 varieties of native grass that she had identified as high performance for Interlake soil types based on a study from the Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association. The total seeded area was 128 acres. She seeded it in the 3rd week of May using a small disc drill borrowed from a neighbor who ran a forage operation near Ericsdale. The seeding took 2 days. The mixture went into the ground and germinated unevenly, the way native mixes always do in their first season, producing a patchy stand that looked, to anyone driving past on the county road, like a field that had gotten away from its farmer. Gordon Fleury drove past it twice that summer, once in June and once in August, and the second time he slowed down long enough to shake his head, though there was no one watching him do it. Petra had set up monitoring points across the field, 18 locations marked with flagging tape, where she measured soil temperature, infiltration rate, and surface residue accumulation every 3 weeks through the growing season. She did this herself, on foot, with a coffee can and a measuring tape, the way her soil science professor at the U of M had taught her 10 years earlier, when she was still a second-year student who thought fieldwork was just the part between classes. By August, the stand had thickened. The milk vetch was beginning to nod. The fescues were knitting together at the surface. The field looked still like nothing in particular. But under the surface, the compaction layer that 24 years of tillage had built at the 8-inch depth was beginning, very slowly, to be broken up by root mass. The soil temperature was running 2.3 degrees cooler in the covered field than in the adjacent stubble ground. The infiltration rate at the monitoring points averaged 1.8 inches per hour. The adjacent tilled field, 0.7. She wrote everything down. She wrote it in a green field notebook that she kept in the glove compartment of her truck. The summer of 2004 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of drought that makes the national news, but persistently, stubbornly dry in the particular way that the Manitoba Interlake gets dry in bad years, when the moisture that should be coming up from the Gulf of Mexico stalls somewhere over Minnesota and the fields just slowly stop getting what they need. By mid-July, the wheat across the region was beginning to show heat stress at heading. The flag leaves were rolling. The elevators were starting to talk about a disappointing crop. Walter's seeded quarters, the ones still in wheat production under his conventional program, came in at 34 bushels per acre that fall. The regional average was 31. He was above average, which he always was because he was a careful farmer, but he was not a good year. He was a careful man having a careful bad year. The North Quarter was in year 2 of the cover mix. It was not producing a crop, but it was doing something else. Petra's infiltration measurements in the second summer showed 2.6 inches per hour at the monitoring points, up from 1.8. The organic matter test she had run in the fall of 2003 after the first full season had come back at 3.4%, up from 3.1 in a single year. She had not told Walter about that number yet because she wanted to have the second-year test to compare it to. She was, in this respect, her father's daughter. She did not say things until she was sure of them. Gordon Fleury had a bad summer selling fertility programs that year because half his customer base had cut their input spend in response to the dry forecast, and the other half had applied the full program to a crop that then came in light. He drove his territory in the late summer and watched fields that had been well managed by the standards of the region come in short, and he did not quite connect what he was seeing to what Petra Kowalczyk was measuring with a coffee can in the North Quarter of the family farm, because why would he? The two things existed in different worlds. Let me tell you about the spring of 2005, because that is when the numbers changed. Petra came back to Arborg after the winter with the second-year soil test results, the third-year plan, and a research paper from the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative at the University of Regina that had quantified, across a 40-farm study in Saskatchewan, exactly what 3 years of perennial cover did to water-holding capacity, nitrogen availability, and yield stability in the first 2 years of return to production. The numbers in the paper were conservative. They were also consistent with what she had been measuring in the North Quarter. The second-year organic matter test had come back at 3.8%, up from 3.4, up from 3.1. The direction was clear. She told Walter about the numbers at breakfast on a Saturday morning in March. He was eating oatmeal and reading the market report, and he set the market report down when she put the soil tests on the table. He looked at the numbers for a while. He said 0.7% in 2 years. She said in the North Quarter, which was the worst ground on the property. He looked at the infiltration data. He looked at the comparison table she had built between the North Quarter and the adjacent field. He did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "You want to return it to production this spring?" She said, "No. I want to do 1 more year of cover, then return it in spring of 2006 with the no-till drill and seed it to oats as a transition crop. Oats will protect the soil structure while the biology keeps building. Then wheat the following year." He thought about it. he said, "and you want to take another quarter off production next year." She had been waiting for this moment. She said, "Yes, the East Field. Same program, then we rotate it. Within 5 years, every acre on this farm will have had a rest cycle, and we'll be managing the whole operation at a higher baseline organic matter than any of it has had since the 1970s. Walter looked at his oatmeal. He looked at the window. Outside, the yard was still white, the March light flat and gray the way it is in the Interlake before the snow finally gives up. He said, "Your grandfather would have called this lying fallow." She said, "It's more complicated than that." "But yes, that's the general idea." He picked up his coffee. He said, "All right, East Field next spring. You draw up the plan." She did not say anything, because she had been drawing up the plan since January. Let me tell you about the spring of 2006, because it is when the story moved out of the Kowalczyk farm and into the county road. The North Quarter was seeded back to oats in the first week of May, using a no-till seeder borrowed again from the neighbor near Ericsdale. No tillage, no seedbed preparation beyond what the drill itself did. The oats went into a field that had 3 years of accumulated surface residue and a root structure from the perennial mix that was still decomposing in the top 8 inches, contributing nitrogen as it broke down. The Sicer milk vetch alone, Petra had calculated, had fixed between 90 and 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare over its 3-year stand. She had reduced the starter fertilizer application on the field to 40 kilograms per hectare, less than a third of what Walter applied on the conventional ground. The oats came in that fall at 94 bushels per acre. The regional average for oats that year was 70. Walter's conventional oat ground, what little he grew, came in at 81. The North Quarter, on a third of the fertilizer input, on ground that had been the worst-performing field on the property 3 years earlier, had outperformed the regional average by 20 bushels per acre. Walter did the math himself. He did not need Petra to do it for him. He sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger book and the field notebook side by side, the way a man sits when he is recalculating something he thought he already understood. The input cost saving on fertilizer alone was $47 per acre. On 128 acres, that was $6,016. And the yield premium over the regional average, at the oat price that fall, added another $4,200. He closed the ledger book. He opened it again. He looked at the numbers one more time, because he was a careful man and careful men double-check. Then he said, "You were right." He said it quietly. He said it the way you say something that you have been approaching for a long time and have now finally arrived at. Petra was standing at the counter pouring coffee, and she did not turn around immediately. When she did, she said, "The biology was right. I just measured it." Walter said, "That's not what I mean." He looked at the field notebook, the green one she had been filling since 2003. He said, "I should have listened when you first brought the folder to the table, not given you the North Quarter like I was doing you a favor with the hardest ground on the property." She said, "The North Quarter is why we have the data." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I know. That's not what I'm talking about." Her mother, Irene, was in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway, and she did not say anything. But she was looking at Walter with the particular expression of a woman who has been quietly right about something for 3 years. Let me tell you about the afternoon Gordon Fleury drove into the Kowalczyk yard, because it is the moment this story has been moving toward since that April morning at the farm supply. He came in October, after the harvest numbers had gotten around. Numbers in an agricultural community travel the way water travels. They find the low points and fill them. Gordon had heard the North Quarter figure from 2 different people before he heard it from Walter directly, and he had done his own math, and he had driven out on a Thursday afternoon and parked his truck by the shop and found Walter doing a post-harvest service on the cedar. He stood in the shop doorway. He said, "Walter, you got a few minutes." Walter looked up. He said, "For you, Gordon, always." Gordon came in and stood with his hands in his vest pockets and looked at the equipment and then at the floor, and he had the look of a man who has practiced what he came to say and is not certain the practice was sufficient. He said, "I've been hearing things about your North Quarter." Walter said, "What have you been hearing?" Gordon said 94 bushels on ground that was doing 60 in a good year, on 40 kilograms of N. He paused. He said, "I've got clients asking me what they should be doing different after the last 2 dry summers, and I don't." He stopped. He tried again. "I was wondering if I could sit down with you and Petra and hear more about what she's been doing." Walter set down his wrench. He looked at Gordon Fleury for a moment without saying anything. Then he turned toward the door of the shop and called toward the house, "Petra, Gordon Fleury's here." Let me tell you what Petra said to Gordon that afternoon, because it is not what you might expect her to say. She did not mention the farm supply. She did not say, "Remember when you told the room I'd been in Guelph too long." She had the same right to say it that Claire Halverson had, and she chose not to use it. For the same reason, it was not the point. She said, "Gordon, the issue isn't the program I ran on the North Quarter. The issue is that any operation that depends on high external inputs to compensate for declining soil health is an operation that's one bad year away from a crisis. You've seen that. You drove it this summer." He was quiet. She said, "The biology we rebuilt in that field in 3 years took 24 years to deplete. We got lucky that the starting point wasn't lower. Some of your clients may not have the same margin." She pulled the field notebook out of her jacket pocket and set it on the workbench. She said, "I'll put together a summary of the monitoring data and the input calculations. Bring whoever you think is ready to hear it." Gordon looked at the notebook. He said, "I appreciate that, Petra." He stood there for a moment, the way people stand when they have said what they came to say and have received more than they expected in return. Then he put on his cap and shook Walter's hand and drove out of the yard. Walter watched the truck go down the gravel road. He said, without turning around, he handled that better than I would have. Petra said, "He's a good man. He just had a system that worked until it didn't." Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story does not end in October of 2006. By 2009, 11 farms in the Interlake had adopted rotational cover periods based on the program Petra had developed on the Kowalczyk ground. Gordon Fleury, to his credit, had been instrumental in connecting those farms to Petra's consultation work, which she had by then formalized into a part-time practice operating out of the family farm. The farmers who came to her were not idealists. They were practical people who had watched a bad summer do real damage to their cash flow and were looking for a system that was less brittle. The soil monitoring data from the Kowalczyk North Quarter became, over several years, a reference set that the Manitoba Agriculture Extension Office began circulating to agrologists' soil health assessments in the region. Petra had not sought this. She had simply kept measuring every 3 weeks through every growing season, because that is what the work required. In 2011, she was asked to present at the Manitoba Agronomists Conference in Winnipeg. She was 35 years old, and she stood at a podium in front of an audience of 300, and she showed 8 years of monitoring data from a single field in the Interlake, and she explained what it meant. And she said, at the end of it, the same thing she had said to Gordon Fleury in the machine shop, that any operation built around compensating for declining soil health is an operation that needs only one bad year to fail. Diversifying your biology is not a strategy. It is what farming was before we decided to replace the soil with chemistry and call it modern. Walter Kowalczyk was sitting in the 4th row. He was not the kind of man who attended conferences. He had driven to Winnipeg specifically for this. When she finished, he stood up. He did not clap dramatically. He just stood, the way a man stands when he wants to be counted. A few people around him looked up. Then more of them stood. And Petra looked out from the podium and found her father in the fourth row, standing with his arms at his sides, and she understood exactly what that meant. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it is where the story ends and also where it begins again. In the spring of 2018, Walter Kowalczyk had a granddaughter named Elodie, who was 12 years old, and spent her March break at the farm instead of going anywhere else because she said farms in March were better than anywhere in March, which was a statement that revealed something about her character. Elodie had been following Petra around fields since she could walk. She knew what a soil probe was and what it was for, and she could read a soil test with more comprehension than most adults who had never needed to. On a cold afternoon in late March, Elodie came into the kitchen with a printout she had found on the internet, an article about a farmer in the Coul Valley in Saskatchewan who was running a mixed grazing and grain system, integrating bison into a modified rotational plan that was producing organic matter results that made Petra's 8-year program look, as the article put it, like a promising start. Elodie put the printout on the kitchen table in front of Petra and said, "Is this real?" Petra read the article. She read it carefully, the way she read everything. Then she looked at her niece. She did not say, "Let me think about it." She did not say, "You can try it on the back 40. She said, "Yes, it's real," and then she said, "Do you want to drive out to Saskatchewan this summer and talk to them?" Elodie looked at her. She said, "Seriously?" Petra said, "The only way to know if something works is to go see it working. That is what the field notebook was for. Not just to record what happened, to remember what it felt like to be the only person in the room who believed it would. The green notebook is in the farm office now, on the shelf above the desk where Petra does her soil reports. Walter's blue ring binder is next to it. Both of them are full, and on the north quarter of the Kowalczyk farm, north of Arborg, in the Interlake region of Manitoba, the organic matter has not been below 4% since 2012. She let the field rest. They said it was a waste. The drought came. The wheat died. The rested ground lived.